Good evening, everyone. Welcome to an event presented as part of FIT's celebration of Women's History Month. I'm Amy Lemon, and I am professor and chairperson of English and Communication Studies at FIT. And I will be introducing our speaker and moderating a Q&A afterwards. And I just wanted to there's always thank yous for gratitude, right? For the people who helped present this event. The event is co-sponsored by my department, English and Communication Studies, with the Diversity Council at FIT. And I want to thank Dr. Ron Milan, who's FIT's Chief Diversity Officer, for his support. I would also like to thank Dr. Patrick Knisley, Dean of the School of Liberal Arts, as well as my co-host for this evening, Dr. Catherine Barnes, and two of my colleagues in the department who hosted wonderful class visits with our speaker, Dr. Dan Cranes and Dr. Jean Amato. Just a brief introduction of our speaker tonight. Hafizah Geter was born in Zaria, Nigeria. She's a poet, writer, editor, and a literary agent at Janklow and Nesbitt. She received her BA in English and Economics at Clemson University and an MFA in poetry from Columbia College, Chicago. Hafizah's poetry and prose have appeared in The New Yorker, Tin House, Yale Review, Boston Review, Longreads, and McSweeney's, among others. Geter is the author of the debut poetry collection, Un-American, from Wesleyan University Press. Wonderful book, highly recommended, which was longlisted for the 2021 PEN Open Book Award and which received a starred review from Publishers Weekly. Roxane Gay and bookshop.com call the poems incisive and devastating. Marie Claire calls Un-American a collection that shimmers with incisive revelations. And Hafizah is one of 2020's buzziest poets moving into 2021, of course. Geter serves on the planning committee for the Brooklyn Book Festival and lives in Brooklyn, New York. And she has a forthcoming nonfiction book, which we can talk more about a little bit later. Please join me in welcoming Hafizah Geter.
Thanks so much, Amy. And thank you all for having me. I'm excited to be here. So to kick off, I'll read a couple of poems from my debut poetry collection, Un-American. Naming Ceremony. My father, who spends most of his days painting pictures, says coming home to my mother stroking out was like walking in on an affair. Bending, he demonstrates how an aneurysm hugged her to her knees. Over and over, my father draws a loss so big it is itself an inception, a story he knows better than the day his daughters were born, every retelling different, bluer than redder, his memory bruising the neck of whomever he can will to listen. His heart is strong. He has the receipts, a scar on his breast that I've cleaned like a smudge on a window. Over and over, my father draws me a picture of the crescent moon fish hooking her hospital room. He loses the story for the pleasure of finding it, his tongue the builder of a maze. I can tell you our best days weren't glad. He's a history whittled down to this single story. In my version, when her mind blew, boys I barely knew played Beirut, cans of Paps crushed against their shoulders, white balls flicking into crimson solo cups, the night lost to the drawl of a far gone gurney. The break-in. When I close my eyes, I see my mother running from one house to another, throwing her fists at neighbors' front doors, begging anyone to call the police. There are times when every spectator is hungry, times a thief takes nothing, leaves you a fool in your inventory. How one trespass could make all others suddenly visible. My mother counted her jewelry and called overseas. My father counted women, afraid one of us would go missing. When I close my eyes, I hear my mother saying, this new country. My cousins exclaiming, Auntie, between the clicking line and their tongues. Tonight, the distance between me, my mother, and Nigeria is like a jaw splashed against the wall. I close my eyes and see my father sulking like a pile of ashes, his hair jet black and kinky, his silence entering 1,000 rooms, then outside trimming hedges, as if home were a land just beyond the lawn, the leaves suddenly black. When I close my eyes, I see my mother mean for the rest of the day, rowing my back in the tub like she's still doing dishes. Naturalized citizen. Mouthing amendments, our mother studied the Constitution. Her whisper, not English, not her Hausa tongue, but something lower, a car revving its engine. Our mother memorized presidents, capital cities, adopted habits like moving her green card one closet to another, kept a manila folder for every year of her life. In the kitchen, she turned cream of wheat into tuwo shinkafa, put kuka under her Catholic school jumpers, stunk of crushed baobab leaves. She spent days in her garden refusing to explain anything but the marigolds. In America, no one would say her name correctly. I watch it rust beneath the salt of so many tongues, like a pile of crushed Chevys. At night, she prayed to Allah for something from America that was more than children. Come weekends, we were counting the naira in her underwear drawer. From her calling cards, we learned Nagode meant thank you. Kai, everything else. Testimony for Sandra Bland. After the miscarriage, she moved to Waller County, wearing the ghost of motherhood and wanting to make old wounds foreign. In my bedroom, I read aloud the list of her contusions, watched an officer drag her from her car over and over again, as if the humiliations would never be done. There were typos in her autopsy report, the words no signs of struggle. I thought her body is my body is a church set fire, is a toil that begs the land, a jail cell, light as a paper bag, the sound my father makes when, after so many years, he says my mother's name. 28, and they split her open where slaves grew cotton at the banks of the Brazos, and students at Prairie View A&M can barely vote, and laid her bare, a coroner's wishbone carved in her chest. In Waller County, they still segregate their cemeteries, name some murders suicide. They fire their police chief, vote him sheriff. Alabama Parable. My father leans down the barrel of a shotgun house and looks in both directions. At one end, my great grandfather is leaking like smoke from my aunt's room, where, in her is left the smell of fire. At the other end, my grandmother, Gussie May, a bull reluctantly bound to her matador. It is barely a secret that this man is the one thing all the women in my family have in common. My father calls it a night so dark the dark could have been broken. Teaches me the hardest thing is to be loved by a woman you can't protect. My father looks down the barrel of a shotgun house, sees in my grandmother, hurt like prayer is a kneeling position, sees that fearing the wrath of God can make you name any angry man king. He still hesitates during a storm because once upon a time thunder meant the Lord was working. Warns his girls to recognize the certain mold that marks men willing to pay for moonshine but never rent. says to go for the knees, throat, eyes. He moves like his whole life depends on superstition, sleeps like he's listening for the creaking door, the smoke signals, the witnesses to my aunt's fires. 72 and tired of keeping secrets. Every Christmas, my father gifts me another, each an heirloom wrapped tightly in his mouth. Lesson 1, there's no God in Alabama. Lesson 2, where the road forks between faith and survival. Lesson 3, no, my grandmother did the best she could. The kill shot, to leave a wounded thing, heart still beating. Testimony for Eric Garner. Daylight, and they dug their fingers into my rectums. Was it intimacy? Was it search? Was it seizure? Bystander footage, marker 433. I become a broken bridge, a wound beneath the belly of a city wolf. Judge, they censor the air, and I see my children's faces. This love is blue-collar work, this exile heritage. I don't regret the kings and queens I've made, though police keep fucking up, keep kicking down the door inside me, master's tools steady, trying to burn our cribs down. My children search mirrors for suspicious activity. Marker 440, the hourglass imitates me. Judge, the wolves, they multiply. So intimate come marker 503, their skin takes custody. My breath away. My brother-in-law recites the takbir. In the revolving door of my sister's apartment, my brother-in-law kneels east, palms the Quran, searching for Mecca. Feet washed, he crosses arms over chest, drowning the days as heavy stones in supplication. My sister, confusing devotion with taking him back, bows by his side. It is a sight that makes my knees buckle, so beautiful and familiar to the days I spent prostrate, mimicking the rakat of our mother's morning prayers, the beads of her misbah squeezed tightly between my fingers as I sung the 99 names of Allah. The first time my brother-in-law leaves, his shadow in the bedsheets is what my sister deciphers her swollen belly across. The second time she comes to sleep at my house, their new son at her nipple like a hooked fish. It is winter in Chicago. My brother-in-law, having shattered every syllable between them, turns silence into metaphor. My sister prays towards the God of our mother and our memories, a God I hope would rather throw away a miracle than bend an ear towards the wishes of a father who has weaponized leaving. My sister looks out into her life, cooled by the breeze of a door slamming, a man who only looks back when returning. My brother-in-law is home again. I cradle their son in my arms so they can pray. Enough history between us that my nephew comes quickly, reaches towards my chest as if searching for my sister's residue. His eyes so new, they are my prayer. With my nephew in my arms, the only thing between Allah and me are two cans and a string. My brother-in-law's need, a valley, my sister's a mirror. With his eyes wide open, my brother-in-law raises both hands and recites the takbir, the storm in him quelling to a melody. And already I know the next time he leaves, my sister will invite him back into her body, her temperature just beginning to drop after carrying the weight of two heartbeats. Testimony for Tamir Rice. Mr. President, after they shot me, they tackled my sister. The sound of her knees hitting the sidewalk made my stomach ache. It was a bad pain, like when you love someone and they lie to you, Or that time Michaela cried all through science class and wouldn't tell anyone why. This isn't even my first letter to you. In the first one, I told you about my room and my favorite basketball team and asked you to come visit me in Cleveland or send your autograph. In the second one, I thanked you for your responsible citizenship. I hope you are proud of me too. Mom said you made being black beautiful again, but that was before someone killed Trayvon. After that came a sadness so big it made everyone look the same. It was a long time before we could go outside again. Mr. President, it took one whole day for me to die, and even though I'm 12 and not afraid of the dark, I didn't know there could be so much of it, or so many other boys here. Testimony for Michael Brown. For hours I lay there, sun at my back, my blood running a country mile between the pavement and the crown of my head. Officer, no ambulance ever came. It took a long time to cover my body. There are politics to death, and here politics performs its own autopsies. My aunties say things like, boy big, black as you. Then the prosecution rests. My neighbors never do. They lose sleep as the National Guard parades down Canfield. I heard my blood was barely dry. I heard there were soldiers beating their shields like war cries, my boys holding hands through the tear gas. Heard my mother wandered the streets, her body trembling between a prayer and a fist. I heard a rumor about riots got started. Officer, I heard that after so much blood, the ground develops a taste for it. Naming my mother. In hallways, in the kitchen, kai from your throat like spicy suya. It meant upset, astonished, your nerves so tired. It was Africa happening inside you. In other languages, kai translates to keeper of the keys, to love. Only Hausa saturates the word with phonemes, meaning you or self, carry or reach. It means to be equal to be enough. So much riding on the indentation of a voice. Mother Kai taught me to listen, to press my ear to the eye of every stranger who butchered your name, which in our first language still means Adam's black Eve. You wanted daughters instead of sons. What you named your firstborn meant beautiful. I was protector. So when you kneeled east in America, cleaned for Isha, I wished you a Nancy, a Beth, something so white it appeared just washed. Hawa, all these years, and there's still the murmur of you. Kai, a rattle in my throat. Our names to familiar sounds turn strange, tightropes swaying in a colonial country. Now I'll read this last one. Thank you. Ida. Only when the surgeon approaches does my father stop crying, his heart sputtering, spent. The anesthesia along begged for reprieve from being a layman in the morning rooms of woman. 6 weeks my mother's been gone, and the surgeon drags his fingers across my father's chest, explaining how 3 calf vessels can rescue the heart. Already gowned, my father listens ambivalently, 1,000 miles from those first nights where he lay side by side with his grown daughter in his wife's bed, the two of us desperate to keep the other breathing. In the morning, he washed dishes, I dried, together slowly domesticating our suffering, both unsure if his fatherhood could stand up in the light. From his hospital gurney, my father gazes at me as though staring across a fog-covered lake. We are twins, afraid to be separated. Years later, when I think of my father, nurses wheeling him down the white corridor, the growing distance between us making his body smaller, then smaller, I will recognize in us the rescuer's dilemma and the drowning man flailing out at sea. my desire to be the savior, than the choice, him or me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hafizah. We have a lot of questions.
Uh-oh.
So I think, and we also have some wonderful, enthusiastic chat. So I'll share some of those comments. There's a lot of powerful, I love that ending. It's, you know, a lot of things that people are saying who are in attendance. I wanted to start off by a question from Katherine Barnes, my colleague. Um, could you talk a little bit about the experience of having a father who is a painter? I'm wondering especially about how watching him work might have influenced your own creative processes. Since so many of our students and colleagues are artists, I think they would appreciate your insights.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one benefit of having a father that's a painter, he also did the cover. This is a painting that he did of my mother 9 months pregnant with my sister. I think the benefits of it is that when I told him that I was going to go get a MFA in poetry, he had no reservations about that. So it's been very helpful in terms of encouragement and just flat out belief, which I know is not something that everybody gets. But I think that it taught me to see the world twice. You know, one just like as as a child through my own lens, but also I actively had someone who was reinterpreting the world through their own medium. Because as you can see, like my father was like a realist painter, but he has but a lot of his work has like fantastical elements to it, and so you know I literally saw someone's imagination lived out, because so often our imaginative spaces are places that are private and we don't really see people constantly putting their imaginations out. So I think there's definitely that. And because, you know, most of his friends were artists, my parents had an art gallery growing up. So, like, we spent our time at art galleries, at museums, at art openings, at like dance things. And so art was always a part of our life. And so I think, you know, it was never something I had to come to know. Like art was always serious and I was always surrounded by people who were taking it seriously. And, you know, in fact, a lot of my childhood was spent listening to people talk about their art. You know, it was like a studio visit, my childhood. So I really got to like listen to people talk about things that they were passionate about and that they loved.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think that a lot of creative people have different experiences of different types of creativity. And I think it sounds like you really had a wonderful exposure to a lot of different media. Um, this is a wonderful question from Audrey, who I think is a friend of yours. What is it about words and poetry that heals and inspires our minds, that heals and inspires our minds?
Well, I think that poetry leaves a lot of space for the reader, you know, because whereas one of these poems in a prose format, I have to fill in a lot. And so I think the like a poem invites the reader in a different way, and that the reader really is like bringing something to it, and in a very collaborative process. And because of like just, you know, the sparseness of it, there are so many different types of interpretations. Like you could like, you know, even when I read my poems, I'm like sometimes I see something new, you know, that like is revealed to me. And so there's always a new way into a poem, and a poem can mean wildly different things to many people. And so I think in that sense, it is a very democratic art form.
Thank you. This is a question from Christian, who is a student of Professor Crane's. What tips would you give to young Black poets who are trying to find places to submit that would be receptive to their voice? So for publication, I believe.
Yeah, I think, you know, a great place is to just start looking where other Black poets that you really like are being published, because that will tell you that there are people there that are receptive to it. There are people there who, you know, especially can handle like, you know, creative language and work that like take risks and is speaking about like outside the dominant culture. So it's definitely a good place to like, you know, start with who you're reading, and that will tell you.
Thanks. So this is an interesting question from Pamela. Do you think the meaning of a poem should be easily understood, or should readers work for it?
I think that like I personally am always trying to be understood. So I mean, poems are so much work to write that I don't know if I'm trying to play coy personally. But I think that the the purpose of art is to challenge us. And so I don't think that there needs to be an expectation that like art should be easy. You know, I don't like art is not intended to be mindless. And so I think that there should be challenges. And I think you know, to for art and art challenges us in different ways, especially poetry, depending on who we are. So you know, this is why like the answer to the student who asked about where to submit like poems as a Black reader, because poems by Black writers are going to might challenge people that like don't read outside of their own experience. And so so like for a poem not to be challenging, like it, first of all, it immediately has to stay in one dominant narrative that excludes a lot of other people. And so I think if as long as the person is trying to be as clear as possible and like is not trying purposely trying to like play a game with the reader, I think, you know, poems are challenging. And like, but so is fiction, so is nonfiction, pretty much everything is challenging.
This reminds me of what you said earlier to some students in some classes where you said everyone needs to be reading something by someone who is not like them or who's nothing like them, that's a good way to become a better writer.
Yeah.
You want to elaborate on that just a little bit for people who weren't there in that?
Yeah, well, I
Yeah.
mean, I think like there's so much of the world to know, and there's no way that we're all going to be able to know it or like firsthand. But I think that if that like everyone has a complex interior life, and that if one is going to write from a perspective outside of their own, you have to do the work. Otherwise you're creating flat characters, and if you're satisfied with a flat character, that means that character is solely there to be like an inanimate object, so they're most likely not an effective character. And there's always the trick of writing that they say that if you want to be universal, be more specific. And you can't be specific about something you don't know anything about. And like the example that I gave is that just like on a basic level, if someone was asked to like write a 15 a 15-page essay about the Lakers, they would and they didn't know anything about basketball, they would have to do the work. And so I think that that like we have to approach everything we write about with that kind of just like respect.
This question is related. Who are your favorite poets?
So many. I feel like it's often just like one of the last poems I've
It's a
read,
trick
but
question, right?
right. I think what like Jericho Brown is one of my favorite poets. Like especially his last few books, the New Testament's amazing. Carl Phillips is one of my favorite poets of all time. I love Claudia Rankine's work. Naomi Shihab Nye's work. I love the new poets who are younger who've had books out that I really love. Come on, Felix, Build Yourself a Boat is a really amazing book. Taylor Johnson's Inheritance, Eduardo Corral's Guillotine. I mean, there's just so many that I could list.
Thanks. Those are some great suggestions. You know, we had Jericho in October. He was here
I mean, he's
in
such
the
a good
same,
reader. It
yeah,
just
he's amazing.
yeah.
um, There's a couple questions that are about your inspiration. So one is from Shayla. What inspires your work? Oh, also, I have to give credit to Portia, my student. She's one of my star students, Portia Cherie, who asked that question about your favorite poets. Amazing student. Um, so we have two questions that are related. Shayla is asking what inspires your work, and then Ashley is asking, how do you find your inspiration when creating your poems? This is an interesting nuance. Does it come from the creatives near you? Because you also were talking about art, the different arts, and that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think people who are creative just tend to be curious. And so I'm just very curious about the world. But I think that, often writers approach things trying to explain something to themselves and trying to understand something, and so this book is really about this idea of like how one contextualizes themselves in a country that tells you that you have no context, or like the context that they do give you for yourself is very, very just like dangerous, ugly, and untrue. And so for me, like my inspirations come from the questions that haunt me, the things I'm trying to um figure out. So essentially I'm just trying to like give myself some rest by figuring this stuff out on the page. Um, and then in terms of like being surrounded by creatives, like absolutely, like I feel like, when we're growing up, our parents were just like, you are who your friends are. It turns out that is true. Because when you have people who care about art, you get to talk about art. I'll also tend to like move in the circles of people who we have interests, and like if you, for example, if odds are if you're a fashion major at FIT, you have friends that are fashion majors, like, or who are really into fashion, and probably odd that you don't know or talk to other fashion people. And so I think that it is really important to have a community of artists because I mean, other people's imaginations are amazing. I think we've all had the experience where we've seen art, read a book, or seen something, and you're just like, you just didn't even know that was possible. To even like that, like where you didn't realize that you had a border around your imagination that what you just saw has broken through, and then right there, everything is different from you because because you now know that. And so I think that you constantly need people in your life who can like show you new things and also people who can tell you that you've been doing the same thing for too long. Like people who can check you.
Yeah, you got to have those people. Yeah. A couple more about the writing process and kind of your experience as a writer. Michaela is asking, do you sometimes struggle to get your words onto paper? How do you combat writer's block?
Oh yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, I think well, first the combat writer's block, I think is just reading. Like usually, if you if you're having trouble writing, it's like odds are you're not reading enough. That's why so many writers they just like have a shelf of books that they just pull from. They'll just start flipping through when they need to write because you're just like something will like if I just read this, something will happen. So I think that's important. And what was the first part?
Do you sometimes struggle to get your words onto paper?
Oh, of course. I mean, like, I hate beginnings. I feel like that's the worst part, just the beginning of any type of project is kind of like being told to clean your room as a child. It's awful, but like, it's just, you just have to power through. And so, like, I kind of tend to, when I'm like writing, I kind of like, if I've got an idea, just like chew around on it in my head and wait till I feel like I have to get to a page to write it. I'm just like, if I just get to like a bursting point, then I'll just have to like spill my guts versus trying to be like, what's the first line going to be, So I think it's just like, yeah, I tend to just like procrastinate until the poem is just like I'm coming out.
So until you just can't keep it in any
Yeah.
longer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The urgency of the moment, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, I'm not saying
Absolutely.
this is good for everyone. So you might need to get your own habits, but I
Yeah,
found it's like what works for me.
absolutely. Eric asks, did writing come naturally to you before you went for your MFA? or was that experience important and reflects on your work today?
I mean, I think it's both. I think that like generally we like as kids you're trying out a bunch of stuff, you land because like essentially as a kid there people are throwing a bunch of stuff at you until you find what you're good at, and then it's natural to find what you're good at and stick with it. You know, if someone has like no one is like born Michael Jordan, but like someone but a kid might be like really good at dribbling, someone's like and so I think it's just kind of like that, and it's also like what holds your attention, because what you're most interested in is what you're going to be willing to literally just put the work into, because there's no one to like at the end of the day no one cares if I don't write a poem but me, you know. So it's really it's like running your own business, you know. You really have to like be in charge of yourself. Yeah.
Thanks. Um, Matt Gelman, one of our professors whose class is here this evening, how does reading your work aloud factor into your drafting editing process? In other words, what does reading and hearing your own poems aloud illuminate?
Yeah, so I mean, like that's part of my writing process. I was telling another class. Um, I record all my poems first. Like once, like when I'm drafting them, I record them and then I play them back and then I edit them. I mean, and it gets and essentially I'm doing that every time I change something or make a major revision. And sometimes when I get closest, the closer I get to the end or to a final, whatever that means, draft. Like sometimes I'm changing just one word in the draft, then I'm re-recording it, listening to the whole thing over again, playing it, and like it can just go back and forth like that for weeks, where even like I like so I it's a really a conversation with like how it sounds and the page, because it's hard for me. I think that like you really don't know what you've written till you hear it back, and you can't hear and speak at the same time. You can't like listen and speak at the same time. And so I think it's like it's really important for you for just like understanding like like where the breath is in a line, because like when you read inside of your head your lung capacity is fictionally endless, you know, but then when you read it loud you can barely make it through a line you've written. So I think it's really important for pacing, for and understanding just like the sonic geography of a poem.
That's a great phrase, sonic geography. I love the synesthesia of that, right? Poets are all about mixing up the senses, right? Okay, Caroline asks, how long did it take you to find your voice in writing? And do you feel it's ongoing?
I mean, I think it's definitely ongoing, because like hopefully we're all always changing. So I think one's voice changes, and then, you know, it's kind of like cooking. Everything's a little spice added in and changing you. Um, so I mean, I don't know how long it took me to find my voice, but it took me a decade to write this book of poetry after like my MFA. So it's a process. But you know, like it's kind of like and like art isn't like building a car. You can't there's no just like it's done. There's always like even now in this like I've edited it and I read it differently now. In some poems like I've changed words, so like it's still constantly being edited, you know. So it's like actually never done.
Yeah,
Surprise.
no, nothing is ever finished, only abandoned, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Hasita asks, while writing, how much of your process is out of emotion and how much of your process is occupied with technique, word choice, form, etc.?
Well, I think that by the time I'm like putting something to page, like I've done the processing work out like already. And so because in terms of like processing the emotional landscape of the page, like I could not do that and then be like, should a line break go here? You know, like I think that would be really complicated. So when I get to the page, it's more just like what is the story that I have, and like how do I tell this in the space of a poem? You know, what like and I usually start with like because it's two things that have to be told, essentially kind of like what happened in a sense, even if it's not a string of events, people need to know like what is actually what's actually going on but then it's also like, but what is supposed to be felt, both from the poem and from like the experience that you're talking about. And so like for me, I'm like, I'm really first kind of like the first draft is just like getting like the actually this is what is happening, like getting the choreography, like this is a story, here's a story situation, and then after that, like once I've got those puzzle pieces down, then that's when the writing actually happens in the revision, and I'm moving things and I'm seeing like what I actually mean to say, what I'm avoiding saying. I think the emotional work that comes in is when you realize what you're not saying, and then you're just like, oh, do I go there?
How do you realize that, Hafiza? How do you realize what you're not saying?
I think that for me, it's usually that like I've been like tinkering away trying to edit something for like forever, and it's not, and if something's not making sense and I'm just like stuck, I'm just like, it's probably me. I'm just like, there's probably something like that, that it isn't said, because the poem at the end of the day can only work with like the pieces I've put in. And so if it's not working, that means there's a piece not there. And so I think just like really trying to figure out, okay, where is that coming from? Because like I'm definitely not of the camp where like because people are writers they have to tell every harm, every hurt. I think that as like regardless of what you choose to do, you get to be judicious about what you share. And so it's figuring out like what are you holding back? Is that what you want to say? Is there something else that you can say and still show? So I think that's really important too.
Right. And what comes into the art and what is sort of a journal entry or something you chat about with your friends.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, Michaela has another question that's really great and very related. Do you ever revisit abandoned drafts and reuse some of the work from your writing for other projects? I struggle with finishing projects myself, Michaela
Yeah.
says.
Oh, absolutely. Never throw anything out. Like I have a doc of just discarded lines that didn't make it. I mean, I've the other day I pulled out like a poem that like just is never going to make it. Like from like over a decade ago, and used it for something, and pulled out a couple lines for like this essay I'm writing. Nothing goes to waste. Writing is the best recycling. And so I think that things that like you don't, I think you save everything because you can't use something now doesn't mean it might have just come to you too early. Like those lines that I couldn't use were just a decade too early, turns out. And it can just be like that. So I think like everything is valuable because your subconscious is always trying to tell you something.
It is. And sometimes we just have to listen, right? It's
Yeah.
hard to quiet the noise. Lizette, another one of my students, this book was so personal. Maybe that's a judgment call. We'll talk about that. But it definitely, I mean, you have your father's work on the cover, right? So there's that. But the book was so personal. In the process, did you have people read and review to get feedback?
Yes, so that's like essentially, most of my MFA program. And then also like after like my friends from my MFA, like I've got a couple of good friends that I still have that like read my work, that like when I need feedback. And so yeah, I think like you always need to be in conversation with your community. Otherwise like, you can get in danger of falling out of touch with that community as well as yourself. And so it's like feedback is definitely like really, really important.
How do you find your community? And
Like
that's
for,
such a complicated question, but I mean, I think it's different for different people. It's different at different times of life, but I think um, especially, well, I'm just going to let you answer the question.
well, I think for me, it's just like it's a tough question in a pandemic, you know, like because like don't leave your house. But for me, like I really found them through like my MFA program, and then once I moved to New York, participating in the writing community. And so like going to events, I work in writing, and so essentially absolutely everything I do is related to literature or writing in some way. And so like you know, a lot of things just happen because like you're the last person someone saw. Like, you know what I mean? And so I think, and so much of like what you learn and new writers I've introduced to is just like from hanging out, you know? Like hanging out is very, very useful in terms of like what you can intake. And so it's tough for like how do you find your community now? But I think, you know, with like people who are doing the work that you're interested in, like people who have the same belief system that you do, and like most importantly, people who don't tear you down, but also who aren't just telling you that you can do anything, because no one can do anything. And like the only people who really believe that we should believe that we can do anything is our parents, right? But and eventually they, as we get older, even they start to realize we have limitations. And so I think you're who are who support you, encourage you, and who will tell you no and say no but keep going, you know, like you don't want anyone who says no and stop.
Absolutely. I love the allusion to parents, you know, and that encouragement. It sounds like you got a lot of encouragement. You described kind of the upbringing of an artist's child before, but it also seems, and this book is so much about generational, um, you know, trauma, and also your prose writing that I've seen glimpses of from the forthcoming book mentions that as well. How do you think your parents experienced, like, for example, your father is an artist. Was he encouraged to do that by his family, or was it a struggle for him
I mean,
generationally?
I think he was encouraged as well. Like, he had an aptitude for it. And like I think like the story he tells is that like when he was in high school, he wanted to take driver's ed, like, and he was going to have to like skip his like an art class that he was going to take, and so he like did it. And then the art teacher went to my grandmother and was just like, your son is really talented, he needs to be in an art class. And so like he couldn't get his driver's license. So but like that changed the course of his life. And like my father was born in 1945, and, you know, this is like this is before the Civil Rights Act. You know, segregation was still like the law of the land. And it was also, I think it was realized that that could get him to college. Was a big deal too, because he, like, my dad got like an MFA in painting from Ohio University. And so like that, and I think he was only he was the second person in his family to go to college. Like his aunt, who is younger than him, went as well. But it was like it proved to be like a way out, you know, or a way up and into a life that, you know, people of color, especially Black people, weren't being allowed.
Um, there's one more question. What was poetry for? This is from Mary. This is a craft related question? And I think we're going to get into subject matter a little bit, maybe. Was poetry always your first choice as far as a mode of writing, or did you come to it in a roundabout way?
No, I think it was poetry from like the get we had poetry books growing up. Like my mom would like make me and my sister like memorize like poems and like recite them at like you know how you parade your children. So we would have to like recite like Langston Hughes poems at like an art opening and all that stuff. And so like poetry was very, it was always very much a part of our life. And also, you know, we like it poetry much a part of like Black Revolution, you know, and so spoken word. And so like for like people who, for like a parent, my parents and their friends who like they raised me in an environment that was very conscious about like oppression, systemic racism, but like just like about like the power of Blackness. Poetry like Nikki Giovanni, like Lucille Clifton, Gwendolyn Brooks, it was like Hughes, it was just it was part of the situation.
Thanks. Marcus Brock, one of our professors, is welcoming you, saying good
Thank you.
evening. And I often think, he says, what do you find difficult do you find it difficult to edit drafts? Sorry, it's my reading. Do you find it difficult to edit drafts born of grief, trauma, and longing? Can it still function as escapism?
I think when I'm at the poem, I'm really like I'm not processing it at the same time. Like I was telling one of the classes that like while like I don't consider poetry the place of that type of catharsis. I think that nothing can replace therapy. Like absolutely nothing. Like therapy's therapy, and but writing is a different kind of work, and it is cathartic in the fact that to do a hard thing and to have done it and to say that you have done it and to be able to hold up that is cathartic, and to be able to for me it is less about that versus these stories aren't really told, and so for me it's less about vulnerability versus my responsibility to get this stuff down on record, because so much of this world is built on misinformation. People love to say slavery was so long ago. No, it wasn't. My grandmother was alive when an enslaved person was alive. You know what I mean? So it's just and so really trying to create a record that is go back to put a record on paper that has been actively dissuaded, erased, and rewritten by the people who've oppressed people. So, yeah.
Thanks. Marcus clarifies, he said he was referring back to your thoughts that many writers say trauma is not all we have to offer up.
Yeah, and the thing is, I guess it's while trauma is part of it, I don't see these poems as traumatic because everyone's life is most people's life is full of trauma, or has trauma involved in some ways, unless because this culture, unless you are very wealthy, to be in America is pretty traumatic, and there are constantly things happening, and so um I think as a culture we are addicted to happiness, and that we don't really process grief. I think like 500,000 people are dead, and have we even had a day of silence? Have we had anything, And so I think that that the in terms of a catharsis, the fact that to resist the ignoring of trauma, I think is how I approach it, because it's strange that it is worse in this country to be seen as a victim versus a victimizer, and so I think that's just such a curious thing about this place. And so I think that while it can be seen as trauma, it's also another way to look at it is a list of things we survived, because so many of the people I write about shouldn't have survived the lives that they had, actually incredible, and the fact that every generation we're moved a little further and we're progressing despite a whole country actively pushing back everybody that's in this book. And so while it's really is book, while it has trauma, it's also a book about the creativity of these people, the perseverance of these people, and also it's a book that's also about how much all these people have loved each other, despite all this.
Absolutely. Hypnos asks, how was the experience of writing in the perspective of those who have lost their lives due to police brutality? The testimony poems, I think, in particular.
Yeah, I think that those are probably the ones that were if there's a rate of emotional, those are probably the ones that are the most difficult, because while I could, when I'm writing poems about my life, we can all disassociate from our lives and just be I'm just going to talk about my sister and not get emotional as long as your sister's out of the room. But but when it comes to writing about other people, you have to stay in that emotional spot. You can't be okay, I'm not going to make this emotional, and I'm going to write about like like black people being like murdered by the police. Like you can't come at it from that space. And so, I think there's like that in my mind, but also like the responsibility of that, like these people are still like the world is still surrounded by people who love these people, and that like how to that to look at them in a way that is beyond a symbol, and this, and like what would it look like, because especially because testimony is such an important part of black life through just like black church and like testimony of that, but also in testimony is something that we really get to do for ourselves in the courts or in like or even in the narrative of ourselves. And so it's really thinking what would happen if they could speak, or if just to could just like to speak, to comment on the cruelty of it, because I think like you can see that like in these poems there's like I'm intentionally not focusing on the rage, though there is that too. But it's just like the cruelty is baffling, and then to see how hurtful it is.
Absolutely. In the Eric Garner poem, you give the markers of the video that has been so proliferated. I'm just curious about what you see as the role of poetry in particular, literature in general, as, I don't want to say complement to, and I don't want to say counter to, but in the context of media, social media, the proliferation of images, video, other ways of getting images and information. I don't know, like, where do you see the role of literature in that kind of a context where a subject might be treated the way you've done that in a very artistic way? Does that make
Well, I
sense?
think, yeah, I'll say that like now that I feel like we've all seen Queen's Gambit, that it's essentially like a chessboard, like all the like art, like all these different avenues of art we have on this chessboard. Some can go diagonal, some take an L shape, like they all move very differently. But like we need it all. Like we can't have a world where there's only activism and no art, and vice versa. And we need people who can do what they can where they can, and when they can. And there are times that like I just don't have it in me to read like I'm just too stressed out from the world. I'm too tired to read a full like just like novel, but I can read a poem, like you can, like a poem is something that is just like, oh, is like ready to meet you wherever you are. Like you only need 30 seconds to read like a lot of poems, and so it's like I think like the versatility of it, it's like literally something that you can like carry in your pocket. You can like just like you can like have a full experience between train stops when we all used to do that. And so I think that that's actually pretty incredible, because like whenever I see people like reading the New Yorker on the train, I'm just like, you're never going to finish that. Like, because no one's ever finished entire New Yorker, though we all try. And so I think that there is something really special about that. And it's I think because of the accessibility of it, it's something that so many people do. Like everyone writes poetry at some point in their life for someone else, for themselves. Like you rarely see someone be like, I'm in love with you and I wrote you a novel. Because you'd be like, that's a little too much. But a poem, you're like, you could be flattered. And so yeah, I think that there's a lot of power and importance to like something that can affect you like on so many different levels.
So now that you have a prose collection coming out, can you talk a little bit about that? First of all, I remind me of the title so we can
At the
share
Black
that with
period.
everyone. Okay, The Black Period. And it's coming out next year,
Yep.
2022.
Yep. Fall in 2022.
Congratulations. That's so exciting. Looking forward to that. And I think it was really interesting to hear how there, you kind of mine something that might have been a poem that came into an essay, but maybe you could talk about the difference for you in the audience in kind of your role as a writer? You know, your Twitter handle is rhetoric and this, you know, kind of like when we're trying to persuade, perhaps. Talk about how prose works for you.
Well, it's one of those things I'm still figuring out. It's like my newest medium, but I think that I think poets in general love the foray into prose because poetry teaches us how you essentially have to be a rubber band to make poetry, And so and for a poem you're just like, how do I squeeze this all in? And so essentially to have your mind like literally go from like collapsing inward to just like putting it all out there. I think there's just like there's like some relief in like not cutting everything, but then you have to say a lot more. So it's a double-edged sword. But in terms, I mean, I think that one thing that this collection allows me to do is to really kind of show the way that we all live lives that are a combination of memoir, politics, like humor, like all these like travel that like are like that living is a many genred project, and so I wanted to write something that like kind of resists this idea of straight memoir because like I don't know anyone who gets to live in memoir alone, and so I really wanted to find something that can actually be mimetic to the way we experience this world. And I think that COVID has shown everyone now how the personal sure is political, because but whereas before this, the government wasn't in in people's homes the way it's been in like people of colors like since the moment like this country started, and so I think like that's like the fun thing about it.
How, if you were going to do, what's the elevator pitch, like some of the topics that you cover in the book?
Well, I mean, so what I am looking at, it's like kind of like the Black period is both a way to talk about like the experience of like growing up in a family and community that just like where like Blackness was the default. But it's also looking at America and it's in like the lens of white supremacy through essentially just like different types of like cultural ages. So it's looking at ableism, it's looking at like queerness, it's looking at like exile, erasure, and it's looking at all these different ways that white supremacy kind of just controls the world, and it's looking at the intersection of how all of these things work, that like homophobia actually does impact Islamophobia and vice versa. And the Patriot Act, no one cared about the Patriot Act when it was just like, oh, we're just oppressing Muslims. And the Patriot Act, I mean, it's one of the most influential things in all of our lives. It's changed how we use the internet. No one cared about because we would never be in a situation where we'd have to live our lives on the internet, would we?
Heaven
Turns
forbid,
out,
right?
you know what I mean? Turns
Strangely
out.
enough, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, and so part of it's looking at how like foreign policy is always domestic and they don't, and we often don't think that. So that's kind of, so it's essentially like the book is essentially looking at like how does one emerge from the erasure that is America.
It sounds like you're also touching on, Matt Gelman had another comment about the way that the testimony poems, for example, also reference your family. So like the public becomes private.
Yeah.
Here's here's a really overused word, intersectional, right? And Hafizah and I are probably chuckling also because we presented on a panel at the AWP conference a few years ago that it started as lunch at the Brooklyn Bagel Company on 8th Avenue. In let's just say after November 6th, 2016, right? Or November 7th or whatever day that was. But I guess looking back now, and thinking about this idea of intersectionality, I mean, I would say anybody listening to the different kinds of topics you talk about different intersectional identities. I don't know. What do you think is the next step
For
for us as a culture? I would say particularly U.S. culture, to engage in some intersectional conversations, and also for artists to kind of amplify.
I mean, honestly, I think the work is for white America to figure out white America. You know, it's kind of just you know, if this was about like misogyny or sexism, and then, like, a man walked into a room of women and genderqueer people and just like, it's like, okay, how do we stop hating y'all? It'd be like, you know, like, or like, tell me how to like allow you to vote. You know, like, how does one answer that? So like, you know, for me, like, this is the question for white America to answer for themselves, because I think like a great example is the riots at the Capitol, where, you know, you're on Twitter, I'm on Twitter, and like black people were just kind of like watching this and be like, staying out of it because this isn't our fight, because we're literally watching white America storm the Capitol and riot because they're fighting about what the story of whiteness should be, you know, and there are not even any people of color involved in that like riot, you know, and so like I think it's really, and like I know white America was shocked by that, but like that is often how white people act and like with people of color, you know? So like it wasn't, we weren't really seeing anything new. There was nothing shocking. And so like, you know, I think the next step is for like white people to figure things out, because it like terms like intersectionality, like all these terms and all this critical race theory, these are terms we invent for white people to figure out the conversation, you know, and that hasn't worked, because like I knew I was living an intersectional life before the word was given, but now it's shorthand for me to speak to, like, you know, white America or like other people who are not, who don't have as many intersections.
Thank you so much. I think, you know, we have to hear that over and over again. I think it has to be, like I said, amplified. I wanted to just put in a little plug for another event that my department's co-sponsoring with History of Art and the Department of Fine Arts. Nell Painter is coming to speak.
That's
Yes.
amazing. Oh my
And so
gosh.
her book, everyone write this down, The History of White People. So she's a historian and she's also an artist. And the history of white people came first, and then she decided to go back to art school, and she wrote a book called Old in Art School. And so, but in any case, I'm really looking forward to that conversation that we're going to have with
That's
her.
amazing.
Yeah, she's coming April 7th. Everyone that's FIT related, and I definitely will let you know if he's we're really excited about that because we want to, you know, it's all different perspectives on all the issues that we're interested in, I think. And I think we're very close to, we've got a few more minutes left, I think. I guess I would love it if you would read one more poem. Do you
Sure,
mind?
sure. Let's see. Read. I know what I'll read. All right. Out of Africa. After so long, our father wants to go home to the continent that names my mother. As soon as next July, my sister says over Skype, while outside my window, New York rain fails to snuff summer's fires. The older she gets, the more I see how her 6 years in Nigeria rival my three, how the memory of the land wisps from the switch of her wrists, how African she must seem, a Muslim raising two black boys in Beijing, locals crouching to take my nephew's photos on daily outings, her youngest, 3, screaming no, his skin so black it is bright. On the screen, the oldest, 8, fills his mouth with all the Mandarin and Arabic his smile can muster. Proudly, he shows me all he has of his stepfathers, Jola and Wolof. Something in my sister knows it is easier in China than America to give her children uncolonized language, easier to raise Black boys to be men who never forget duty or home. Months and months before her stroke, our mother began looking like a woman who would never see hers again. She read Candide, gave cousins uncharacteristically tearful goodbyes, and slept into the evenings when her legs would ache. In a journal, she wrote all of her names: Hawa, Teeny, Amadou, Jeter, then nothing else. When I shudder at the questions I cannot answer in our birth country, my sister insists Mom would have been this way too. It's cultural, she will say, needing even cruel things to be simple, a laugh in her voice I can't place. When my sister says Nigeria, her voice says starved to see her father again. What with tickets so cheap? She suggests we return with him to the country that can call his daughters' names by blood, the land where a family will ask why I haven't a husband, cousins, aunties, sending theirs out into the rainy season to fetch me one.
I'm clapping for everyone. There is nothing like hearing the author's words in their own voice, and you've given us such a wonderful experience this evening. Do you have, I don't know, any final thoughts to give to the FIT community before we end?
Stay quarantining and everyone get vaccinated because I want to leave my house. But
Fair
other than
enough.
that, summer's coming again. Everyone hold on. Everyone hold on. And watch some
Thank
good
you.
TV in the meantime.
That's great. And I just also want to register that in our Vimeo chat, we have a lot of wonderful, thank you so much, so great, beautiful, et cetera, et cetera. I know I wish you could see everyone's faces, right, in a room. So you'll have to come back when it's time to do that. But I really
Absolutely.
appreciate this time you've spent with us today.
Yeah.
And I want to again urge everyone to go to Hafizah's website because there are links to more of her work. Um, you deal with the pandemic in one of your essays, at least that I've read, that's
Yeah, for
online
Yale
now,
Review.
that will be in the book. And, you know, I think we're going to be seeing more and more of that, you know, creeping into people's work because it's just, you know, we got to reckon with it somehow. But
Right. We cannot pretend this away. We
no,
tried,
we
remember?
can't.
Like
We
last
can't.
this
Yeah,
whole
that didn't
time.
work. That didn't work,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah, so I will add, stay safe, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful, wonderful evening and take good care.
You too. Bye, everyone.
Bye.